The Iran war is starting to shake up economies. In many countries, long lines are forming at gas stations. The dollar is going up. Interest rates are rising against other currencies. And oil and natural gas prices are breaking records almost every single day, guys. Shockwaves are coming one after another. Economists are saying we've basically lost 2026. This is not a time to try and make profits. It's a time to minimize losses. It's about survival right now. That's what they're saying. According to many experts, the crisis we're entering doesn't look anything like past crises. It's like a perfect storm heading straight at us. So what makes this crisis different from the others? Why are we constantly hearing such big fears and worst-case scenarios? As the crisis deepens, people are naturally comparing it to past examples. The closest one is the Ukraine war that started in 2022 and is still ongoing. When Russia, one of the world's major oil and gas exporters, entered that war and restrictions were placed on its energy exports, it shook global economies, especially in Europe. Over time, things somewhat stabilized, but oil prices did go up, especially in the early days. Another crisis people bring up is the 2008 financial crisis, and the most common comparison is the oil crisis of the 1970s and its impact. But as Rockefeller International chairman and Breakout Capital founder Ruchir Sharma pointed out in a Financial Times article, this Iran war-driven crisis is very different from past ones. It's much more severe, more destructive. The first thing that makes this crisis different is its timing and the conditions we're in right now. The shockwave coming from Iran has hit global economies at a time of extremely high debt and budget deficits. We're facing the most indebted governments in history. Governments and central banks don't really have enough policy tools left to soften rising energy prices or absorb the economic damage. Let's start with debt. The world has never entered a crisis with this level of public debt and budget deficits before. This burden seriously limits governments' ability to soften the impact of high energy prices through subsidies, tax cuts, or increased spending. In other words, even if they want to, they might not be able to take the same measures they used in the past. Put simply, governments are going to struggle to cover rising prices from public budgets. State treasuries aren't as full as they used to be. Right now, the coffers are basically empty. Everyone is drowning in debt. There are countries out there with debt levels 1.5x, 2x, even more than twice their GDP. Just look at Japan, the US, even China. Everyone's in debt. Another major issue is that central banks don't have much room to maneuver. The Iran war broke out at a time when the effects of COVID were just starting to fade. That whole pandemic period led to inflation in almost every country due to heavy public borrowing and consumption outpacing production. The US and European economies had only recently started to get inflation under control. Last year, the year before, and even now. In the US, for example, the fight against inflation is still ongoing. Even before the war, the Federal Reserve wasn't willing to cut interest rates because inflation was still high. Trump says, cut the rates, and the Fed chair says, I can't. Why? Because inflation is still elevated. They want to see it come down a bit more. They're also looking at employment and other data. They don't want to overheat the economy unnecessarily. According to the Fed, the oil shock caused by the war is creating a new wave of inflation in the US and other countries. So under these conditions, cutting interest rates has become much harder. Because now there's also the risk of stagflation. But if you don't cut rates, then you risk killing economic growth. These are really tough choices. Unlike past crises, it's not easy to just print a bunch of money, hand out cash, or roll out massive low-interest rescue packages to support the economy. Governments already used those tools heavily during the COVID period, and now that playbook is basically exhausted. If Western banks cut interest rates, they'd basically be fueling inflation. But that move might not even boost production. So you lower rates, and yeah, prices start rising in the economy, but production doesn't really get supported. That's not the usual outcome. What you end up with is inflation and stagnation happening at the same time. That's what we call stagflation. And another reason why it's so hard to get through this Iran war-driven shock is the overall weakness of the global economy. This crisis is hitting governments and economies that were already on shaky ground. Even before the Iran war, global economies were dealing with serious problems. Trump's aggressive and constantly shifting tariff policies had already disrupted the balance from China to Europe. On top of that, competitive pressure from China was also making growth harder. Before the Iran war, for example, European economies were already struggling to increase exports and grow. Germany was basically hovering on the edge of a recession, and then the Iran war broke out under these exact conditions. Like we said earlier, governments and central banks just don't have the tools or resources to deal with a crisis like this. The traditional methods used to prevent or soften economic downturns are either already used up or have become too expensive. You can think of it like this. Imagine a guy who's already dizzy, barely able to walk, completely drained. Then someone comes up from behind and pushes him, or even kicks him. That's basically the kind of impact the Iran war is having on the global economy. Economies that were already trying to recover got caught off guard by this new wave of shock, and they just don't have the tools to handle it. And keep in mind, the Iran war is only about 38 days in. It hasn't even been 2 months yet. If the Strait of Hormuz stays closed, and on top of that the Bab el-Mandeb Strait also gets blocked and transit completely stops, the global economy as we know it could basically collapse. We could see back-to-back major shocks. Of course, you might say, no crisis lasts forever. The world doesn't just end like that. What gets destroyed eventually gets rebuilt, and systems recover. If oil and natural gas aren't coming from the Persian Gulf, or if aluminum and fertilizer supplies are cut off, sure, alternatives will be found somehow, but that comes at a huge cost. We're talking about a completely different region here. Like we've said in previous videos, the Middle East is basically the center of the world because of its location and other factors. Replacing it, trying to source the same resources or strategic advantages from elsewhere, would be extremely expensive, and it would force global balances to be completely reshaped. And honestly, it's hard to predict who will get crushed under all this. The first to be hit will likely be unprepared developing economies. Why? Because they're not ready. They don't have enough oil reserves. They haven't stockpiled energy or resources. Another reason is that these economies are already fragile. They're the kind that could collapse with just a small push, so it's only natural that they'll be the first ones to feel the impact. This situation could lead to protests, uprisings, and even regime changes. The policies of Trump and Netanyahu, who want regime change in Iran, are also putting the stability and political systems of many countries in Asia and Africa, countries that aren't even directly involved, at risk. That's the picture we're seeing right now. But this won't stay limited to small or poorer countries. If the war continues and deepens like this, the bigger the economy, the bigger the impact. And if major economies start losing balance, this could end up looking like the Great Depression of 1929, or even worse. Because unlike 1929, today's world is way more interconnected. Everything is integrated. Everything is linked. The system is so complex that it's actually more fragile. You pull one brick, not even the bottom one, and the whole structure can collapse. If aluminum supply drops, everyone feels it. If natural gas from Qatar is cut off, crop yields in places like Pakistan get affected, and so on. So in a world that's already heavily indebted and full of other problems, energy shocks can be much more dangerous and long-lasting. And more importantly, countries are pretty much defenseless right now. The governments and central banks that are supposed to fight this crisis have already used up most of their tools and resources. They were caught unprepared. So what happens next? We've painted a pretty grim picture, but honestly, we're just describing what's happening. And since this crisis doesn't really resemble past ones, it's not easy to predict what comes next. On top of that, the key players steering this situation, Trump and Netanyahu, are highly unpredictable. They're a major source of uncertainty. And the sides involved aren't acting purely on rational economic logic. You can include Iran in that too. Ideology, religion, and emotions are playing a huge role in shaping this war. So the course of the war will continue to determine how deep, how long, and how intense the outcomes will be. At the top of the list of what's likely to happen, rising inflation again, combined with slowing growth, basically stagflation. Some economies, like Germany, were already experiencing this even before the Iran war. Germany, for example, was already dealing with a ton of economic problems, and this war could make things even worse. Another major consequence of the Iran war will be governments getting stuck between subsidizing energy costs and taking on more debt. They'll either have to support energy prices or borrow more money. If governments choose not to borrow, then we could see less financial support, stricter austerity measures, or higher taxes. Because many governments are already heavily indebted, countries that aren't heavily dependent on energy might get through this crisis a bit easier. But those that rely on energy and also have high debt levels are going to have a really tough time. Right now, everyone is kind of in shock. No one really knows how to respond. Nobody can even think about the medium or long term. We can't even see 1 month ahead. And then you've got Trump saying things like, I'll bomb this, I'll bomb that, I'll set oil wells on fire. I mean, are you serious? That oil doesn't just belong to Iran. What does it even mean to set oil wells on fire? That's something only a madman would do, like Nero, right? Because think about it. If you set Iran's oil wells on fire, they'll burn non-stop. Iran is one of the biggest oil producers in the world, with some of the largest reserves. And then he says, I'll burn their natural gas too. Okay, go ahead, burn that too. But what happens if you burn both? A huge amount of oil and gas gets wiped off the market, and when supply drops like that, prices explode. It's not just China that gets affected. The whole world feels it. And do you think Iran will just sit there and do nothing? Of course not. They've already said it. If you do it, we'll do it too. They could go after Saudi oil facilities. It turns into a chain reaction. Bahrain, Kuwait, Qatar, Saudi Arabia. If energy production in this region gets hit, we're talking about a massive chunk of global supply. And it's not just about quantity, it's about quality too. Middle Eastern oil is top tier. You can't even compare it to something like Venezuelan oil, which is heavy and difficult to process. The difference is huge. Some of the oil from places like Iraq or Saudi Arabia is so refined it can be used in aviation fuel. That's the level we're talking about. So when people say 1/5 of the world's oil comes from here, it's actually more critical than that because of the quality and strategic importance. That's why we can't see what's coming. If oil from this region stops flowing, if the Strait of Hormuz closes, and maybe even Bab el-Mandeb after that, the crisis could be far bigger than people expect. The shockwaves are just starting. It's like waves hitting the hull of a ship, one after another, hitting global economies. Countries that import energy from the Persian Gulf and those that export to them are already starting to feel it. You look at trade data, exports, imports, and you can see March numbers already getting disrupted. But these are just the first waves. The real shocks haven't even hit yet. If the war drags on into May, June, July, or even the fall, those waves will hit much harder. This crisis will affect everyone, but Asia and Europe will be hit especially hard. These regions depend heavily on Middle Eastern oil and gas, especially South and East Asia. More than 70% of the oil passing through the Strait of Hormuz goes to countries like China, India, Japan, Indonesia, and South Korea. That's huge. Some countries like Sri Lanka and Myanmar have already started rationing fuel or raising prices sharply. Others are trying to hide the impact by not passing price increases directly to consumers, instead using government subsidies to soften the blow. But with high debt levels, they can't keep that up for long. Most Asian countries weren't prepared for a crisis like this, maybe one or two exceptions, so they don't really have the tools to absorb the shock. The crisis hits, and they're left not knowing what to do. Now, some bigger players like China, Japan, and South Korea do have strategic oil and LNG reserves. Those stockpiles can act as a short-term buffer, but eventually they'll run out too. And once they do, you need to replace them. If alternative sources can't be secured, factories might have to shut down, working hours could be reduced, and inflation pressures will increase. China might try to increase domestic production. It is an oil producer after all, even though it relies heavily on imports. Another option for China is increasing imports from Russia or shifting to other energy sources, but no country can just walk away from oil and gas right now. Another problem for China is falling demand from the countries it exports to. The global economy is interconnected. If one falls, it drags others down with it. Places like Dubai, Abu Dhabi, Kuwait, and Qatar are massive consumers. They export oil and gas, and in return, they import goods, shoes, clothes, cars, from countries like China, Turkey, Europe, and the US. So if they stop earning, they stop spending. And if they stop spending, they stop buying. Middle Eastern economies are expected to shrink this year. Some estimates say around 6%, others say it could go beyond 10 to 12%, and that's based on current conditions. If things escalate further, if oil fields start burning and retaliation continues, contractions could go well beyond 15%. And what does that mean? It means they stop buying goods from China, Turkey, the US, everyone. That drags the entire global economy down with them. China, being a trade-driven economy, would get stuck if it can't export its goods. And remember, China is the world's largest exporter. That's why this matters so much. But this kind of bottleneck isn't just a problem for China. It affects every country that sells to the region and depends on it. Just like Asia, one of the biggest victims of this crisis is Europe. Europe's natural gas reserves are already low, and the wounds from the Russia-Ukraine crisis still haven't fully healed. They're still fresh. Now, with the Iran war pushing oil and gas prices even higher, Europe is facing a second energy shock. There was data today showing that energy bills for small businesses in the UK doubled in March. And because of high debt and budget deficits, European governments are also going to struggle to subsidize energy costs. That could lead to rising inflation again, increased recession risk, and stricter austerity measures, meaning cuts and higher taxes. If the war drags on, Europe's room to maneuver shrinks even more. Governments are basically backed into a corner. Central banks can't really cut interest rates anymore because they're still fighting inflation, and governments can't roll out new support packages through borrowing either. Since both Asia and Europe are net energy importers, the shock is hitting these regions much harder. The United States, on the other hand, is relatively less affected, at least for now, because of its energy independence. It can even benefit as a producer from rising oil prices. But that's mainly in the short term, and from a macroeconomic perspective, the full impact of the war hasn't hit yet. So far, the biggest economic losers are countries and regions outside the US. The US is also losing, but not as much as Europe and Asia, for now. And we should also point this out. Within the US, there are both winners and losers. Oil companies are benefiting right now, but consumers are taking a hit. Another important point: this shock could be long-lasting. Because of high debt levels, traditional rescue methods may not work this time. In fact, many tools might not even be usable. As a result, we could see sharper economic slowdowns, factory shutdowns, and social tensions in both Asia and Europe. In the US, even though there's no direct energy shortage, rising costs are making the rich richer while significantly reducing the purchasing power of lower-income groups. Even before the war, the cost of living was already a major issue for many Americans, and this situation could make it much worse. For example, gas prices have gone from around $2.50, $3 per gallon, to nearly $5 or $6. On top of that, higher energy prices are increasing production costs, which can push inflation even higher. Interest rates will likely stay high, and the dollar has strengthened significantly during the war. A strong dollar might be good for consumers, but it's not great for producers. And the combination of high interest rates and persistent inflation could push the US economy towards stagflation as well. In short, even for the US, the road ahead looks like a minefield. If Trump gets stuck in a prolonged conflict in Iran, things could get much worse domestically. On the other hand, if the war ends quickly and is seen as a win, it could hurt US rivals while somewhat benefiting the US. Some analysts believe that might actually be Trump's goal: to push oil prices up, pressure China, and strengthen the US economy at the same time. But if that's really the plan, it's a very risky game. Because if things don't go as expected, it won't just be Iran or struggling countries in Asia and Africa facing instability. The US itself could see serious internal chaos as well. In today's video, we talked about the economic impact of the Iran war and warned that this crisis could turn into a depression even worse than 1929. Make sure to share your thoughts in the comments below. And if you liked the analysis, don't forget to like the video and subscribe to the channel. Take care, and see you next time.